fine, as long as make sure your microphones are turned on.
Yep.
Okay, then you should be good.
Excellent. So we'll jump into it. I will call to order the Affordable Housing Trust Fund meeting for April 23rd. In attendance, we have myself, Brian Sullivan, Dorothy Moore, Rima Sherry, Charity Grace, and Judith Wagner. I'd like someone to make a motion to shift the agenda to move item 6 to the beginning of the meeting. We're going to have a call with Laura Sheffield from MHP.
Go ahead. So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. So if we could have an approval of the agenda.
Motion to approve the agenda as amended.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes. Are there any? We'll just clear that away. On the minutes, any corrections, statements? Anybody have a chance to comment or discuss on them?
No comments.
Call the
Move to accept
Okay,
the
great.
minutes from the February 19th meeting.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. All right, we'll bring Laura, am I saying this?
Laura Schufelt.
Schufelt, from Mass Housing Production, to talk through with us the kind of implementation plan items we talked about, delivering to her and working on building out programs. Megan, is this just a straight up dial out, or do you know?
Dial 9 and then
Didn't do that right.
I have a 9-1.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, probably 9 and then 1.
Hello? We'll find out here.
You know, please don't.
Hi, you've reached Laura Schufelt with Mass Housing Partnership. I'm unable to take your call at the moment, but if you leave a message,
Okay, we'll try again. 9, 8, 5, 7.
I gotta do one.
You have to do 1, 9, 1.
What?
That's what she said.
It's a noisy phone.
That's
9, 1, 8.
No, I get you that online and then
Oh no, I meant the noise.
Oh, yeah. He was deleting digits. Hi, Em. Fabulous. I met someone last night who was very excited that he's in a housing Nantucket unit.
Nice, who's that?
Cody
Nice, yep.
said he's going to be at the party.
You know, he grew up in our unit. His mom was our tenant on Benjamin, so he grew up in that unit, and now he's got this one by chance.
hi, you've reached Laura Schufelt at Mass Housing Partnership. I'm unable to take your
She
call
might have
at the
gotten
moment, but if you leave a message, I'll get back to you.
Okay.
why don't we try her back in a couple minutes? She may have gotten a call or something that she
great.
she didn't know exactly what time we were going to call.
Now, I don't see in the packet, did you guys deliver her
Yeah.
an item that when we do have a call with her, we can all be looking at, or?
Yeah, so we sent her the list that Brooke had put together of the 5 different programs you all had been talking about, and I kind of summarized them in the email that I sent around yesterday. I can give you a copy of this, but we basically, said to her that there were essentially 6 programs that we're interested in developing: the subsidizing private development on land owned by the town or the trust, down payment assistance, rental subsidy, buy down, subsidy for developments on private land, and then, I had added an incentive program for rental unit owners to put a restriction on their own property, be willing to fill it by lottery, and be able to perhaps entice them from moving from renting seasonally to year round. Probably wouldn't be made whole, but In discussing this preliminarily with Laura, she thought that this, with the 15-year restriction, these could count toward our SHI program.
Which
So-
is somewhat conflicting information from previous DHC discussions in hopes that we could do that.
Well, yes and no, but let's talk about it more with her on the phone.
Okay.
But just so you all are aware, Laura is in their community, she's the assistant director of their community assistance program, and it's the same program we had worked with on evaluating the Nantucket Inn opportunity. They recently had someone leave, so they're a little short-handed at the moment, and they have a big training, as some of you have attended. The Housing Institute is coming up in June and so forth. So the point is that they may not be able to themselves, jump on, if you will, assisting in developing any one of these. However, I've said if you can direct us to a consultant or a community that has a program that you feel might be applicable here, that would certainly be of benefit to us.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So I have it, do you want to, I have it here, so,
Yeah, it would be great if that made it to the packet. and
yeah,
I
I'm
don't
sorry,
know-
we just,
Yeah, I
do
don't
that.
know how, if we can add things after the fact.
is there any way to
or-
print something here? Megan, do you know? Let me go ask her.
Okay.
Let's table it for now since she's not on the
Okay.
phone, and we'll move to the other items, but in the future, I think we want to make sure that we get this kind of correspondence into the packet, so either general public is seeing it or we have it in front of us as we're discussing. So Tucker, will you text or communicate with her?
Yeah,
when she's
I'll
available?
try to give her a ring.
And then
Yeah.
we'll move on and then come back to
Yep.
this item once she's ready. So that's going to bring us to a discussion on the Neighborhood First program. So congratulations, everyone.
Yay.
We're incredibly well funded now. So
No
let's
kidding.
get to work and roll up our sleeves and get this program designed and implemented. There's been some kind of offline discussion in the next steps and what we need to look forward to moving this well forward. I'd like to see this board kind of come up with a multi-step game plan, deliver a proposal to the Board of Selectmen as what we would like to see moving forward in the next few meetings, and how to get liftoff here. I think some of the critical items, it'd be nice if the original proponent of the article could join us along some of the road here in his mindset of what their goals were. But in absence of that, I'd love to move the ball forward. Some of the discussion kicking around has been creating a work group or a subcommittee with people from other boards, or if we were to put forth a skeleton of work and to deliver to that group to kind of weigh in on their expertise from their specific fields, that we can kind of go through a stage process.
Can I weigh in?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and the way I see this going is that there's a combination of us setting up, using the expertise and the knowledge that we have to help a new work group get ahead of, rather than having them start from scratch. So have it almost be a back and forth between this board and this work group, so that we give them a piece of work with a foundation under it for them to flesh out, and then they come back to us, and then we give them another piece of work, and then they come back to us. And I see the work divided up in three particular pieces. One is the criteria and evaluation of pieces of property for purchase for the Neighborhood First program. This,
If I may, within that, there is some discussion of the way the article was written. There's interest in properties, there's whole purchase of properties, and there is something else. There was some other discussion.
Buy downs, basically, right?
Purchase of covenants within properties.
Yeah, and there was some discussion about the idea of potentially, buying a life estate type of thing where the person could remain in, but the house would eventually come into the program. I did have a chance to talk to a little bit to Laura about that particular method, and that is not going to work as far as counting on the SHI list.
Until the property is available to be occupied in lottery.
Correct.
Right.
However, is it possible for us to fund the creation of secondary and tertiary units on the property that would qualify it?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
if the units are restricted and they're filled by lottery.
So in other words, if we bought a home with a person who didn't qualify at 80%, but we put a secondary on, qualified that at 80%, then they would both potentially, maybe, I don't know. So in my thinking, what we do is we say, okay, we're going to gather a work group and we're going to say, okay, your first project is criteria for acquisition of interest in or properties. Here are the questions that need to be answered that we're aware of. Go to work and come back to us with something. And so we give them
A real media outline.
like the bones and then ask them to put the flesh on the bones rather than having them start from scratch. And then I see the second question. So after that, it's the criteria for purchase and then it's the process for acquisition. What's the procurement process? How does the finance department involve? What's the bonding? What's the timeline? And can we put together a document for people that respond to an RFI or an RFP so that they know what to expect in the process, how it will differ from putting it on the open market in terms of time frame and process. So that would be sort of question number 2 for the work group. And then finally, question number 3 would be ultimately the management contract for the properties and creating an RFP and designing that and coming up with all the different things that need to be decided around a management contract. So I kind of see it as a several month-long process. The first step, obviously, is to decide who's in the work group and gather that group.
And then one other critical item, and I don't know whether it becomes the fourth, but is the timeline for acquisition and properties coming to the SHI list being the fundamental lead-in of the program, that it was for SHI qualified properties. What is the rollout that we want to look at to maintain a safe harbor capture with other projects that are coming online? So there'll need to be a communication with Ann's group, understanding the Richmond timeline, who's bringing expected units to market and what's their schedule over the next 5 to 7 years, and how do we infill in a good way. Reba?
Something that we had a problem with in the past when we have looked at properties, I think, was the uniqueness factor. I'm wondering if in working out criteria, we can kind of get around that somehow by having, and working with the finance director, of course, to figure that out. But we don't want to run into that, well, it's not unique. I think we'd rather be able to say, yes, this checks all our boxes.
So later in the meeting, Brian, the finance director, will come. That's one of the things I want to have him touch on. So understanding uniqueness in the procurement process, and then he would be a critical member role of the work group to kind of develop that kind of procurement outline for people, because as you said, we've run into that problem, and I don't think people understand the complexities in going through the town becoming a purchaser.
And just to clarify, uniqueness is more of an issue when we're presented with a property to buy and we're considering it, right? Then it's a matter of uniqueness. But if you put out an RFP and you're getting responses to an RFP, then the uniqueness thing doesn't apply because you've done the whole RFP procurement process. So by doing an RFI followed by an RFP, then you are meeting the demands of the procurement process, so you don't have to meet that uniqueness standard. So
the other thing is to ask a land bank member or land bank staff when we're deciding about the life rights, because that's something they do all the time. So they'll, that's easy for them.
Yeah.
Explain that to us.
I think we're gonna wanna work closely with them about a number of different elements of what they do, including tax benefits.
So if we kind of roll back to the beginning of this, three-step outlined process, right? What are we looking for in experience to help round out this program in setting a
Yeah.
subcommittee together, right? I would think that we would probably need a couple of non-board seats, community at large kind of representatives, so the general community is represented. So if there were 2 non-board seat members, I think it's something that we want to have a breadth of experience, but not too large of a group so it's efficient, right? I think that probably a finance committee member would be a beneficial seat.
And then I would say planning board or NPEDC. Just to have that zoning
So that would
expertise.
be 4.
What were, 2 members of this board.
Well, so
Two
I've got
public
2
members.
general
Oh,
public.
2 general public, sorry, yeah.
And I would see somebody from another housing interested group, be it one of those members or whomever, we could, generally put out to see who comes in. Probably a BOS representative, whether it was this member from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or not.
Land bank?
It'd be great if we could get a land bank individual.
Yeah, I think, wow, that's really loud. Yeah, I think it would be great to start engaging them now, with that being one of our goals overall, but this might be a good one to involve them in.
And then we would want 1 to 2 members of this group.
Yeah, I would say 2. So 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're looking at a group of 8. Do you need an odd number? Or they're not voting on anything, right? They're just,
Making recommendations based on, kind of the work that we put out there.
But can I, sorry,
Please.
but if it happened that the select board member out of this group filled that seat and the planning board and PEDC member, then you may be double counting on size. So maybe the goal would be one of those overlapping here, and then that way you'd end up with an odd number.
yeah.
I think that makes sense, and I'd rather stay on the 7 side than the 9 side in the overlap conversation. I think if it's just gonna hard to make meetings with the bigger the group gets.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to have a select board member that wasn't part of this group, whomever it is, maybe the representative from the NPEDC, because at least for the moment in the lifespan of this, that's probably not going to be the same board member. But I think it would be great to have another select board member hearing and seeing this and seeing how it goes.
Yeah, I would actually be lean toward having people who aren't not duplicating who are here, so we get more voices beyond our own.
But wouldn't you want at least one person so you've got a connection?
Oh yeah, I was planning on at least 2, but
Okay.
not more than 2.
Okay.
So, of the representative from this board.
And then what's our expectation of timeline and the requirement that we're asking this group for? I think that that's an important thing for us to, kind of put out there and decide, how much work are we asking of them and over what time period? Right? If we're gonna be delivering the skeleton and the questions and, looking for expertise, are we thinking of this as a 3-item 3-month, a 3-item 6-month, a 3-item 12-month? There's the general recognition that this entire project's going to take some time to put together. There's also an opportunity that Richmond's bringing the community safe harbor in the near term. So what is our rollout for ownership of our first unit and then work with this group? So, yes.
I just want to ask a question because I thought the 4th one that you brought up is really important, how it's used as a tool in safe harbor. Is that something that you think this board, that 4th piece, this board will figure out, or is that something that this work group will figure out.
I would think that this board should figure that out,
Okay.
but deliver that information to this work group so they're thinking about it in the implementation and the timeline for closing. Like in my mind, there's no reason that we couldn't be marketing an RFI that if you were interested in selling your property in this program in the course of the next 5 years, that we couldn't enter a contract with someone for a closing in 3 years or something along those lines, so we knew what the pipeline looked like over a longer period of time. That would be my thought.
Okay.
More of a progressive opportunity than a reactive
Yeah.
to the free market thing.
I think in terms of framing it, at least in my mind, it makes sense to, even if I were to go back to the select board and say, these were the things that we identified as the initial key elements of the plan, referring to it as four key parts, but there's 3 that a work group specifically will be tasked with, just to start saying, to really keep that safe harbor element is so important. So I think kind of packaging this into a way that's easier for people to understand what we're doing. I just see it as a 4-step or 4 key elements that we're addressing, 3 of which go to a work group.
And I think in a way that question of shy list management goes into the acquisition thing. Like, what does a longer term contract do? What's the process for entering into a contract that executes down the road? So that sort of goes into that question of acquisition, the flexibility of acquisition over time in the service of shy list management. So I think it rolls out, but I think the overarching umbrella principle is shy list management. I mean, I think in my mind, I have a challenge in my head, right? We need to create affordable housing because people need it. And we need to manage the shy list. So we protect ourselves from 40B. But in managing the shy list, if we wait 3 years or 2 years to acquire houses, it means people aren't getting into housing. So I think having that conversation of the pros and cons of placing shy list management above actually putting people in housing philosophically is something we should talk about.
One thing to remember, though, you also have the $5 million.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and for me, it's never really about putting the priority of the shy list over actually getting people in houses. I just think that this is, sort of had a specific intent. It may be more multifunctional than we realize at this stage, but I think that just making sure that we can use it to its full advantage by giving that that part of the puzzle as much weight as possible. And I also think that is something that, speaking to the additional resources that we need, it's almost separate perhaps from the management of these houses itself. It speaks to the need for ultimately longer term resources in managing our shy list. So I guess I just want to, managing our shy list and understanding the real need. So that for me, that's why I'm sort of pulling it out a bit more. And I think each of those other 3 elements are so important that not to try and do too much. Be very clear, particularly if we have a work group that hasn't been thinking about it as much as we have, making it very clear and simplify kind of a complex situation. So keeping that management of the shy list and things like that separate from what are the criteria for acquisition. So
I would agree with that. I think, too, the expertise on this particular point may be different from the expertise needed on some of the other kinds of things. So some of it is really managing risk, like Richmond should have been online well before now. So how do you anticipate and what are your contingencies? So some of that is to people of the type listed, that may not be something they're used to thinking about, or that may be you need planning staff to play a role there,
Yeah.
or things like that may be a little bit different too.
yeah, exactly.
The other thing I wanted to note is there'll be some turnover in this board, right? Because in June, right, is when this, so that also, we want to get started, but we have to be aware that there's going to be integration of additional people here, perhaps, depending on how things sort out and who wants to stay or one thing or another. So that'll be important, but hopefully you could really kick off and get going as soon as you've got it's going to take a while to recruit people and everything like that. So when you talk about time frame, this is late April. I would hope by end of June we'd be be up and operating. I think for some of this, if you want to recruit people, you may have to not just put a notice in the paper, you may need to talk it up to people, and we're going to need to have like a description of what the expectations are and the time demands and the expertise. How would we do that? What approach would we take to try to recruit people in these categories? Do we have an idea about that?
Well, I think when it comes to town boards, we can just send a request and, you know, they can take it up at their meetings. That's easy. I think members of the public, you know, I don't know. I guess maybe an ad or maybe, you know.
I think there's some active social media discussion that has gone out there.
Yeah,
and
to find
I'm not
people
sure
who
how
are
we
interested.
participate with as a town board, but there's got to be some opportunity to circulate that.
And it might not be a bad idea to recruit another real estate person too, because that's a, you know, good expertise to have.
The town is bringing on a real estate person.
So I think, yeah, I
and
think
there's a couple of advisor seats I would consider that would work with this committee. One would be Brian Turner at the finance department.
Right.
The real estate seat position that the town is filling, which is in the near term, is that
It's, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
eminent?
I didn't know
Imminent,
about that.
yeah.
Obviously Tucker's position, I would want some as a advisor. Who else would we be looking to?
Yeah, I mean, I think those three would be the main support folks
Okay.
to the work group. Can I just go back to the makeup for a second? I just want to
Yeah,
make sure I
please.
heard it correctly. So the idea would be essentially the person who is the select board representative to the NP and EDC would sit on the committee, if I heard that correctly.
I think we said the select person that is on this
On this,
committee.
No, actually.
I was actually saying, I mean, I think whoever comes, the two
Thank you for
people, yeah,
clarifying.
from this board, I think could be anyone, I think. But I was just thinking that it would be great to have a select board who is not on this board. And I was thinking to try and get the numbers, if it made sense to have a select board from NP and EDC, or just open it up to any select board. Either way, but a different select board was my goal.
yeah, exactly. So there would be a someone from here, a different select board member than who sits on this board on the committee that may or may not be the NP and EDC representative from the select board, a land bank representative, then is it one or two folks from this board?
I think we said two. yeah.
Okay, so then a finance committee member, and then two members of the general
At-large members.
at large. And would one of those members be Tobias? I feel it's important to have one of the two sponsors of the article there to represent the intent of what this is about.
I think that one of those two people should apply for
Should
the
apply.
seat.
Yeah, okay.
If they don't apply for the full seat, I think that we, as a group, should ask for their whole participation.
Okay.
Whether as a,
Advisor.
advisor,
Yeah.
a public member at the meetings.
Yeah,
Their
okay.
input should be highly
Okay.
involved.
That makes good sense. So you potentially, if I was just doing the counting right, have 8 members, depending on whether the select board member on the NP and EDC is doing double duty. Just,
Great.
yeah.
And my hope from this meeting is that we come with a document that we can provide to the Board of Selectmen at a subsequent meeting, that this is the recommendation that we're making to the Board of Selectmen as the next steps for the program, and allow them to say, oh, well, they want a 9th, or it should be a 7th, or.
Tucker, you forgot a housing group member.
Well, I was including that in the general public.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to ask about housing Nantucket, and would an application from them be considered general public?
Well, I don't know whether or not they may or may, if they're going to make an application for the RFP, we'll have to work through.
So you think there might be some conflict of interest?
I don't know the answer to that, so I don't want to put that seat in if there is, right? They can make application as an at-large member if there's no
Yeah.
potential conflict.
Okay.
That would be,
So we need to answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's tough, obviously, because we probably won't have a lot of options for who would manage it anyways. But, thinking about having someone who ultimately will be managing or who has a management background, at least looking at it the whole time, so that we're creating something that is manageable.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, perhaps what happens is if Housing Nantucket wanted to have someone sit for the first two parts of the process, the criteria for acquisition and the process for acquisition, and then recuse on the creation of the RFP for management.
why don't we send the question to council and see what they have
Well,
to
I was
say?
gonna say, Brian is the chief procurement officer, and he may have some thoughts
input.
about it.
Okay.
I was gonna mention, would it make sense to consider as one of the members, so on the presumption if we're at 8, odd numbers are good, would a potential 9th member be like a seasonal resident with a lot of expertise in the housing area? And like, I'm thinking of someone in particular, but,
I would think that would be great, but if this is a process that's gonna carry over 6 months, it may be a hard commitment for somebody to make,
right.
that may or may not be able to travel in or out or participate. I like the concept, but
Yeah.
the reality of how long this may take.
Well, right, but given 85% of this $20 million is coming from the seasonal community, do we want to offer the opportunity for that constituency to be represented in, thinking about how this money is spent?
Well, and especially if they could connect by phone and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we would outline for them beforehand what the time commitments are and so forth, and then, they may or may not, we may or may not get someone. But I think to at least offer the opportunity might be a good thing to do.
I would agree. And it's in keeping with our strategic plan. So
Awesome.
I like that.
So there's number 9.
Okay.
Do we feel like we're well represented in that kind of number?
Yeah, it's a big group.
So if we bring the conversation back to what is our timeline goal, so we set some goals and we're working towards something in getting us to a place where we complete number 3 as Brooke outlined them, and knowing that number 4 is in there, but that would be on the back of this work group with the town's housing coordinator involved. We would need to spend a focused meeting with probably our own work group delivering to a focused meeting on each one of these items to then deliver to the next group. So I would want to chunk each one of these items off per month. So we're at 3 months, then we deliver to a work group. Would our expectation be to give them a month, 2 weeks? Do they report back? How does this feel to people as far as setting some goals on timing?
I think if it takes us 3 months to chunk these off, I would almost look at this as trying to see if a work group could tackle, given 2 weeks, it's a 2 or 3 week period, a little bit faster than one a month, just to keep it fresh in people's minds as well and try to get it done a little more quickly.
So if we get a committee created by June, we would deliver to them item 1 for their first meeting, which would be a July meeting or would be a June meeting?
I almost imagine, so we deliberate on item 1 in May. We deliver that to the committee, and then they report back to us by our June meeting, a month later. So they have a month to meet, deliberate, and come back with preliminary. I mean, I think it's a test to see how much time they do need to do it, and say, our expectation is that you're gonna come back to us to our June meeting. And then at our June meeting, we take in that report and begin the work on step 2.
Begin or deliver? I would think we would want to deliver step 2 after our June meeting.
Right, that's what I mean. So we work on it in June, step 2. So we receive their report on step 1 at our June meeting and do our preparations for the next step and hand that off after our June meeting.
Okay.
And then they come back in July. So it's like a stepwise. We hand them the ball, they report back to us the next month. We create the next ball, hand it to them, and they come back. That's quick. That's 3 months.
So that would
So-
be a completion of all 3 steps delivered to
In-
them
in
with
4 months.
comments by
In
the,
4 months.
by the end of September. Which in theory, we could take it all together and give it back to them one more time.
Or meet together.
That's assuming that we have this work group.
By June.
I mean, well, prior to June,
No,
if you're
prior to-
saying that
if you
they
wanna have-
report back to us
Yeah,
for
I
a June
think-
meeting.
Right.
Yeah, it's gonna push it, it's gonna push a month.
Okay,
later.
so let's, yeah.
I almost wonder too if we need to be a step ahead of them, as in we have 1 and 2 fleshed out for the most part. We give them 1, they give us back 2, or sorry, they give us back 1, we review that, and then we've got something for them to be mulling over, because I'm just worried that when they give us back 1, we're going to need more resources potentially or ask questions. It might not be as lockstep if we're not a little bit ahead of them.
Right.
My goal would be take the comments back on 1, hold them, work on them internally, and deliver comments on 1, 2, and 3 either back to them for approval all at once at the end, rather than hold moving 2 forward and moving 3 forward while we flesh out 1. Does that make sense? Because I would expect 1 is going to take the most amount of time to flesh out with real work, either legal or a variety of different processes. So I don't think we're going to be able to respond timely on comments to 1.
Well, yeah, I guess, and I'm not quite sure if I'm just misunderstanding what you are saying, Brooke, and what you're saying, Brian, but
Okay.
I basically, my concern is that, or my question is just how quickly we're going to be able to take their comments and then turn them into something else. It sounded like you said, let's figure out 1, 2, and 3, give them to them, and then they have a month to come back with number 1, and then a month to come back with number 2, and a month to come back with number 3. I'm hearing from Brooke that it's we give them 1, they give us back 1, we give them 2. I'm thinking
that's
that
what I'm thinking.
that's what you're thinking.
That's what
I'm just wondering. I guess I'm just wondering if we're actually going to be able to digest what they've given us, because I'm thinking that, and I don't know, but I'm thinking that 2 depends on 1, 3 depends on 2 and 1. So if we're trying to give them the foundation for 2 and we're trying to digest number 1 still, I don't know, I'm a little bit.
Okay, I hear you.
I would say to do quality work, people typically need to intake to come up with a draft and then look at it again. So what I wrote down about 1, I think that's 2 months of work by a work group, even if we give them a sketch. So I wouldn't want to set them up to fail, if you know what I mean, to say click, click, especially once it hits summer and people have visitors and one thing or another. So I think we should, I frankly think that if we spent time at the main meeting going through 1, 2, and 3 to see where we are, if we start recruiting for members of this and really assume that they would start in June with the charge that we deliver to them in June after we've really had a meeting to talk and a meeting to perfect, that at the end of the day, we'd be better off rather than trying to, it's too complicated. I mean, they haven't been working together before. They've got to meld as a group. It would just be my guess. I don't mean to slow it down. It's just.
No, I actually was feeling like that was way too aggressive as I was saying it out loud, so.
And you know what it is? I was thinking is just,
Ambitious.
Yeah, I'm wondering if, I guess what it is if they come back to us with number 1 and it impacts how we look at number 2, we might have to make changes that we can't make in one meeting, and then they're there waiting for us, and we don't have something for them.
So
to chew on.
and we're also going to have other work to do. I mean, I think that's the other thing we have to think about is that unless we're going to have extraordinary long meetings, we do need to parse this out over time. So if we think about it more in terms of 6 months, so we meet in May and we define number 1. We talk about all 3, but really define number 1.
Excuse me, Ken has joined us and is the new real estate specialist for the town. Which we
Congratulations,
are
Ken.
very excited about.
Yeah.
But can you,
We need to call Laura, don't we?
no, I told her we'd probably call her around 11:10.
Okay.
But could you please re-articulate the 1, 2, and 3?
Yes.
Yeah.
Happy to. So Ken, we're working through the kind of the next steps on the Neighborhood First program. And the goal is to create a work group, 9 individuals who will weigh in with their expertise from their different boards and such. So the first item we're chunking out is the criteria for purchase. So what will qualify as a property or an interest? How do we want to look at those properties?
Is that the issue that I had with?
You probably should be at a mic.
Thank you, Ken Bogrant, real estate specialist for the town of Nantucket.
Get you.
Get used to it, right. The question I had was sort of what is the overall goal with respect to the 20 million in terms of what we're trying to achieve? Because I know that when I read the article, it was broad enough to provide a reasonable amount of latitude in terms of going forward. But as I started to think about it, the issue with respect to how to be able to do this in affordable ways, yet get the maximum amount of benefit for the dollars spent, didn't necessarily easily jump out at me in terms of how you did that. And so obviously the issue with respect to the criteria for the type of property is a very critical one. But the question that I had in my head was did it necessarily have to be to go out and buy existing properties if there was a more efficient way to be able to achieve the same with some of the dollars?
So I think that's exactly the question that we want to flesh through in the criteria development. So while we want to enjoy the latitude that the way the original article was written to apply the funds so they're effective, that we need to have a kind of structured concept on what we're going after, and whether it's raw land multi-lot opportunities to then develop or existing structures to add, and then where are the efficiencies that we want to look for as a community in the sense, do they offer public transportation or paved roads or dirt roads or time of built, where there's depreciation in the structure. So because it's so wide, we need to kind of sharpen that up and get a breadth of experience for it. That's the goal of step 1.
Okay, and the second thing was, my question was with respect to timing, because when I had lunch with Tucker on Friday, and he told me that if in fact the Richmond properties come on in June of this year, it gives us 2 years of safe harbor. All right. So my thought was that with respect to acquiring properties, we also need to take a look at the economic situation and the point in terms of where we are in the cycle of real estate pricing. And so if we do have 2 years with respect to be able to begin to implement this because of safe harbor, that the thought with respect to the timing of executing this strategy with respect to the use of the funds is a critical factor as well.
So that was the fourth of the 3 items that we discussed, is that this group would develop a timeline for known projects coming online so that we can effectively add new units in a timeline that's appropriate to maintain the intent of the article, which was safe harbor from the shy list.
Right.
So we're really looking at years 3, 4, and 5
Okay.
as far as the implementation and onlining or onboarding of properties, knowing that there is, and I'll look to Tucker or Ann, a 6-month process through DHCD to make a unit qualify. So are we looking at first purchase in 18 months?
Yeah.
To bring it online in the 25th month?
So like theoretically, let's just say that Richmond comes online in June and it's 2 years of safe harbor. It's 2 years from that date in June. If this was going to be our vehicle to another year of safe harbor that we wanted to dovetail with the ending of the Richmond Safe Harbor, we would need to be teed up to, in essence, be acquiring the properties at the beginning of 2021 and be teed to submit this would most likely be under the LAU program, submit those applications, right at that time as well. They have to be approved in the year in which you are seeking to have them help provide safe harbor. So we in effect would have like a 6-month window at the beginning of 2021 in this theory.
So in thinking of that and working backwards, it looks 6 months before that in a marketing opportunity to the community, who will be participants, how to work through step 2, and fortunate time Brian just worked in the process for procurement.
Because the other issue that came up to me is that one of the criticisms that government always gets is that you give them something to do and then they sit on and they don't do anything. So I think that we have an educational process that's really important in terms of explaining the nature of the plans so that everybody understands what we're doing and getting on side with it, as opposed to being able to already start to shoot us before we even haven't gotten out of the starting gate.
So in this 1, 2, 3 step process, the subcommittee, it seems like we're looking at a 6-month window to have something concrete, so then we can start an education of this is the plan, this is how it will be implemented, this is the process, and then we'll be able to market for another 6 months to then hopefully be closing in 18 to 20.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Ann hits her hand up.
Okay.
Yes, Ann.
Ann Cuspa, Housing Nantucket. So excited to hear you all talking about this. I just had a couple of thoughts about it. So thinking about, I love the work group idea, the 9 members. I think you got a lot of expertise on there. I was wondering if, you may consider, like I was thinking about your timeline, love timelines. What if this is such a successful program that we want to ask for more money for 2021, FY 2021? So then I was thinking, that would mean a citizens article or some other kind of thing in November. So I feel like if we kind of had that good idea going into town meeting, next year's town meeting, that was kind of where, to me, that's like a good end goal. When we're talking about these different 1, 2, 3 criteria is great. The key elements, as Rita said. For me, it's, the shy list, safe harbor, excellent. But also getting those units on the shy list is really important. So you've got your safe harbor goal, but also if we're getting units on the shy list, those count, and it's providing the housing. So if we're able to spend this $20 million by putting these units on the shy list right away, why not keep going with that? And perhaps there is a way to have subcommittees within your work group that, you've got those 3 elements in mind, and then you're breaking off into your 3 subcommittees and coming back together. This work group could come back together and then amend the way the other subcommittees might be thinking. I think that might be a way to make the process more efficient and perhaps even get it done in 3 to 4 months. So those were just my thoughts. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. I kind of lost it. My
So you were we were giving Ken the 3 steps.
So covering criteria of purchase, I could jump right to process for purchase. This is, I think, the mainstay of why we asked Brian to come to today's meeting. Brian, one of the concerns that we have had as a board in the past is kind of the procurement rollout, how we work through the RFI, the RFP process, identifying uniqueness, gathering deposit money for negotiations on purchases. So in creating a subcommittee, we want to work through a detailed outline and process that we can deliver to not just the subcommittee, but also to the community so they understand kind of what the rollout is. Is there anything that you can add for us today in an overall, I've had this meeting with you in your office, but some of the members of our board have not, in how you might envision us acquiring some of these properties working with procurement? I'll just note that he took his jacket off for this long explanation.
I
move the mic because I don't want to stand in the corner. So we have had this in a very general way. Typically, when you're going to procure property, it falls under, I think it's M30B, Chapter 16, which talks about the disposition or acquisition of real property. There is an exemption when you're trying to acquire property where we could make a uniqueness determination, which goes against having to do some of the advertising relative to purchasing the property. I think talking about if we did that, I think it would free us to make an offer on a particular property. I don't want to get into specifics about any parcels or any discussions about that, but that would allow us to do it probably in a way that would allow us to make an offer subject or contingent upon successful appraisal, etc., and so on and so forth, just like you do on any property that you are going to purchase. The RFI, which we talked about, we did talk to town council, and he does believe we could put it out, which essentially is a request for interest. We would identify the size of the parcels that we're looking for. We'd put out a request, and anyone who owned a parcel of property fit those criteria could submit and let us know that their parcel could be available for under the right circumstances. Now, we had talked about the fact that this group would have to identify what those criteria would be for me to be able to put it out, because I'm not really sure what those criteria would be, and I don't want to be the one to write them for you. And then we would put it out, and it typically in these situations, it'd be for a period of about 30 days. It would be out, it'd be public, and we would put it on combis in the central register in case any off-island folk, when we'd put it in the newspaper as required and post it, so that anybody who owned property that met the criteria would have the ability to submit what the property is, where the location is, the size and everything, so that we could determine whether it did meet the criteria, and if it met the criteria, then it would go on a list of parcels that we may be able to attempt to procure at a later date in the future, or relatively in a shorter method, if that was what the committee wanted to do.
And if one of those properties was identified as something that we were interested in, can you outline the step to then move forward and close on that property?
Well, I mean, the steps would have to take a long, hard look at whether we'd be able to get around the uniqueness criteria or not. We'd probably then, if we couldn't, and we had to put it out publicly to procure the property, then we'd have to write the specifications in a way which you can do and be a little bit more stringent in the particular size of the parcel or the location that you may be looking for, and then go through the normal bid process, and the people would then submit a bid and would tell us what they would sell it to us for.
So just so that
that would be that's a very public process. So
I just want to identify that so people understand. So that's basically an RFP in the newspaper identifying the property and the purchase price.
Well, not necessarily identifying. You can't identify the specific parcel. It would be the way you would do it is the criteria would be changed from the larger scope of the RFI into something different potentially. Okay. I mean, we'd have to look if the RFI was successful, then we could look at how the best way to approach being able to acquire a parcel that somebody expressed interest in selling to the town would be. And it may still be that the uniqueness could be used. I just, without seeing it, it's really difficult to tell you that it absolutely can be used. I would have to see what they were or how many there were.
So just to clarify, we're talking about two different routes.
You're talking
right?
about two different routes.
We're talking about somebody walks in the door today and says, I have a parcel of land that I'd like to sell to the Affordable Housing Trust.
Completely different than
Has
the
to
RFI.
qualify under uniqueness for us to go to contract. Or we could say, can you wait? Because we're going to put out an RFP.
Well, I think there's two different routes. If there's a parcel known that may fit criteria that you've already discussed, okay, without talking about specific parcels, but identify criteria, okay, on public transportation, on town utilities, of, just for discussion, 10,000 square feet, whatever those criteria are, then if it's an individual parcel, it may be able to be done, and we can consider it unique, and we could follow the uniqueness, which requires me to make a determination, which waives the advertising requirements for us to be able to try to procure the parcel, okay? the other way, because we may not know that there's other parcels that, and this might be useful in terms of the, well, it might be useful even on the 5 or the 20 million, to be quite honest with you, is to actually put something out for people to express interest in having parcels that they might consider selling. And it will give you an idea, the committee an idea, on where these particular parcels of land are located. Because right now, I don't know that any of us have a really good idea of what parcel, whether somebody might be interested in selling land or may own a parcel of land that would fit the needs of the community and what the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is trying to do, without actually putting something out saying, do you have a parcel that you might, that fit these criteria, that you might be interested in trying to find a way that the town could buy it. So there's two very different approaches and strategies. The first one is if there's an identified parcel, then we could consider whether it would be unique, and if it is, that would allow us to bypass actual public advertising and be able to more than likely be able to put in an offer to purchase it with contingencies, which would have to be discussed. And we could, to get to that point, we'd also want to sit with town council to make sure we're mapping out exactly every step, because this is a large-scale purchase, and we certainly don't want it to be inadvertently something missed. The second is to find out how many people that own land in the town may be willing or considering selling, and get an idea for where those pockets of land and those potential available sites, might be.
And then you follow up from the responses to a request for interest with an RFP.
You would, more than likely.
That's a second round of advertising.
Right,
Okay,
which
just
is
to
when
clarify.
you would actually attempt to see what somebody's willing to sell the parcels for.
Okay, because then they come and they say, I would like to get this amount of money for this property.
Understanding those steps, if you had the deliverable of, from us, the requirements that we wanted in an RFI, what would be a realistic timeline to go through that RFP process?
Well, I think that they're two very distinct. I mean, I think that the RFI part of it is, if the committee gave me the list, the scope of the size of whatever they were looking for, the criteria. I mean, putting it in the paper, writing it, and putting it in the paper, advertising it, putting it on combines, putting it on Central Register, and writing the scope and everything is very quick, and we could probably put it out for 30 or 45 days to allow maximum interest. Getting to the next point of doing the request for proposals or request for price would be slightly longer, I would assume, because it all depends on how many how many people submit interest in potentially exploring the possibility of selling a particular part, whether we could do it. I mean, if you got 100 parcels, it might take you a couple months to go and look at every one of them and see if they actually really do fit the criteria of what you've laid out as the criteria in the RFI. If it's 3 parcels, it might take you 20 minutes. I don't know, without doing this first step, it's difficult for me to tell you that the next step, going to try to procure something, could start in 30 days. I just don't know that answer, because I don't know how many parcels people might have in mind, or would be come in as part of that.
Now, my follow-up question is, after going through RFI, and hopefully 1 or 2 or 3 RFP processes, anything that is then brought subsequently, does that provide the opportunity for uniqueness to be identified because it has gone through that process and was not?
I would say we'd have to talk about that. I don't want to specifically say absolutely without thinking it through very clearly with respect to a parcel. I mean, generally uniqueness is that we can't get it anywhere, and the attributes to the particular parcel are so unique that we'll never find something on the island. And I would be hesitant to say yes in response to that.
But at the very least, we need to work our way through the first 2 steps to get.
We need to work our way through the first step, absolutely.
Okay.
And then figure out what the second step is to be. That would be my thought.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have questions for Brad at this time? There's obviously a lot of potential follow-up questions that come from this.
For the work group, I mean, I think.
Could I just
Please,
have one? I just want to be sure the takeaway about uniqueness is clear in my mind and everybody's mind. So I have understood that in a sense as that's the rationale why you wouldn't have to go through an RFP. Am I correct on that?
We could make it. We could believe it says the chief procurement officer makes a determination that the parcel is so unique that advertising would not benefit the public good.
Okay,
Okay.
but if it is not possible or appropriate to make that determination, then in the interest of fairness and giving everybody a chance and no inside dealing, then you use an RFP, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
We would go out through public procurement to do that.
And maybe one other angle here that I don't know if this is plausible or not. When I think about some of the other players on the island who might possibly say, hypothetically, just out of nowhere, a nonprofit entity, another nonprofit entity might acquire property working in some way to foster affordable housing. If they had property that went to them, they wouldn't be having to go through this RFP protocol unless they somehow have ties to the town. But if they do have ties to the town, so they're kind of like the agent of the town, they would need to be following that. Is that right? I'm just trying to test the margin to be sure I understand if there's others working with us.
Well,
in some fashion.
I'm trying to think of a scenario on how we'd be involved if a nonprofit had acquired a parcel.
Well, perhaps they acquire it because they could act more quickly, or they say they are approached by people who want to make estate gifts or something like that. Again, not any that I know of. I'm just anticipating there could be some somebody out there who cares about affordable housing and might have more direct ties to people who want to sell in the public
And then are you
interest.
thinking that the town would purchase it from them?
That's what I was wondering. So what I wanted to just be sure not
I'd
to
have to
follow.
go back and look. I mean, there are certain
Okay.
exclusions within the procurement law itself, depending on who you're dealing with, what you're procuring and whatnot. So, I don't want to say yes or no right now. I'd
Okay,
have to
well,
go back and look to
I just
understand that.
wanted
Sure.
to lay that out because from time to time when we've gone through our strategic planning process, we've talked about, well, there are other players here that are procuring property in various respects, and if in some way someone approached them with property that they may not want to follow through with, and yet they might be an intermediary that could act more quickly to, say, put an option on property
Sure.
or something of that sort. I just wanted to raise
And
with
it
you.
very well could be a possibility. I don't want to.
So I don't
I don't
need
want to say no right now.
No,
without
I don't
having
want to
time
put
go
you
back.
on the spot,
No,
but I
that's-
just thought it would be useful to kind
Yeah.
of surface that question. It's like, I know public meetings or public records, if it's a step away, you get into situations, people may make assumptions in error about
Right.
what covers. So
Yeah.
when you have time, could
Yeah,
you
no,
just
I would
reflect
certainly
on
look at that and see if
Thanks,
that's a
Brian, I
possibility.
appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Lots of questions for the work group to answer.
I did want to make one comment just so that everybody is, because I know that we're working really hard on figuring out how to spend the generosity and with the generous votes that were given to the town at town meeting and at the ballot. We have the requirements letter from bond council, which I have to satisfy before I can borrow 1 penny of this money. And everybody should understand that there's the potential that some of this interest is going to be taxable and not tax exempt because of the way we may have to do some of this. If we enter into an agreement with a third party to manage and do any of this, then some of the debt will end up being taxable. Because the requirements letter require me to answer probably about 300 questions for all of the debt that we have before I can start borrowing it. And one of the questions related to both the 5 million and the 20 million is, does the town anticipate entering into a management agreement? And if they do, then they have to review it before to determine the taxability of the debt. So I just want everybody to understand that there's a lot of work on my end to get the debt cleared, to be able to clear the hurdle of borrowing it as well. So that if everybody had in mind that we were going to be able to, I can move relatively nimbly, but there's still work that I have to do to be able to even get to the point that I can be as nimble as everybody is expecting this to be done, just so that everybody's aware of that.
What is the impact if it is taxable?
Probably between 50 to 75 basis points higher than what I would pay if it was exempt. So if I would borrow it with a true interest cost of around say 2.5, which is where all the debt is right now, if it's taxable, I more than likely would be paying close to 3 or over 3% on the debt.
Now, is that on the total debt or just the portion that is?
Just the
management?
portion that, well, it's the portion of the debt deemed to be not de minimis enough to not be considered, exempt or taxable. So I don't know. That number would depend on what the size of the borrowing and the issuance I'm doing is. I mean, if it's 500,000 and there's a management contract, it may be de minimis. If I'm borrowing 5 million and there's a portion that will not be, and that would have to be taxable. And I don't know what that is until we get down the road, but everybody needs to understand that there is potential based on the way that we're going to be moving on this, that there may be some of this debt that's taxable.
So that's going to fall into our step 3 that we'll put on notes when we deliver it. That can you read that? I can't.
I said change in the taxability of borrowing.
Potentially, I'm
Yeah,
not going to say that it definitely is, but there potentially is, because I've had 17 pages of questions with 300 questions from bond counsel. So it's a lot.
Brian, would the difference in that be if a nonprofit was the manager versus a for-profit
I don't think it would, and it's not going to necessarily matter. And and the management's going to be put out to procurement, so I have no idea who it would be. But I don't think it's. The fact is that it's still, we're paying for a service, so that we're not doing it on our own, and we're procuring a service to do that. So there's some rules that come into play with that.
Made a difference. Okay.
Yes,
But say hypothetically, if some of the Airbnb tax could be used to pay for management that isn't borrowing, so that would keep the debt.
Well, it doesn't matter how we're paying. The fact is that we would be procuring properties that would be privately managed by an entity other than the town.
Okay.
That's how. And there's an agreement for management of the properties. It doesn't matter how I pay for the management services. It's the debt that's backed by the town.
I see. Okay. That's what I wanted to be sure I got. Thank
It's
you.
an encumbrance on the property, in a sense, yeah. Okay. That's my semester.
So Brian, I think I know the answer to this question, but just for the record. So there's a working group that's going to be formed with representatives from different town boards and the general public. And that group is going to be advising the board on the criteria and the timing and a host of different things, including also looking at the management contract potentially. So would it be advisable or not to have a representative of a organization that may be a potential bidder on the management contract on that committee?
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Because we could run into the problem where if you had a potential bidder for a management contract on the subcommittee that was working on it, it could be construed that potential bidder helped develop the specifications and criteria, and that's not allowed under procurement law. If an entity helps you write the criteria to a substantial enough mechanism, then they would be precluded from actually bidding on the work.
Right. Thank you.
Good to know.
Great. Anything more for Brian? I know he's got a tight schedule.
No, I cleared out most of it till 11:30 or so to
great.
help you to try to help out. So if there's more, I'm happy to do my
I have
best.
one quick question while you're here. I don't want to take time. The actual process of getting cash to make an offer, what would that look like? Like if we wanted to write a check to go under contract, is that, in terms of speed of the process?
I mean, we could finance it and then borrow the money I'm personally not anticipating actually borrowing any of this money before June 30th, so please don't tell me that you've got anything that you need to do before then, because it's going to change all of my plans. I can have it very quickly.
Okay.
Depending on the size of the issuance. I mean, if it's 20 million, then we probably, it'll take a little bit longer. If it's 5 million, it's, it could take longer. If it's, say,
$25,000 for a deposit check.
well, a deposit check I can write. That's easy. The larger scale purchases we can borrow at any point. It's just about, one of the determinations is whether I want it rated or not, and usually we make that determination on the size of the issuance. If it was 500,000, I probably wouldn't have it. It wouldn't have it rated. The thing that we have to talk about is the fact that I would rather not be going to the market a lot of times, because it's very even though money is, as everybody likes to say right now, even though money is cheap to borrow, it's expensive to borrow in terms of the amount of legwork that has to be done in terms of bond counsel, financial advisory services, and all of that. They add up after a while. And so that's why we go to market twice a year. We go in June and November. And I would like to keep it limiting to no more than twice, but if I had to go a third time, it's fine.
That's something to note on number 2, process to purchase to a 6-month closing cycle.
But a $25,000, I mean, we could, that would be able to be taken care of. That's not a big deal.
Are we
That we
able
worry
to
about.
go to contract with a deposit subject to determination of uniqueness?
I would say no.
So we have to
because
determine
You'd have
uniqueness.
to make that determination first, because the uniqueness determination then tells you which track you have to follow. So it would be difficult to put a deposit on something subject to determination and then turn around and then make the determination that we should have bid on it before, or put it out to procurement before we put a deposit on it.
Okay.
But I might make the suggestion that if we think that it doesn't take long to make a uniqueness determination. I mean, if I'm not 100% certain, we can certainly talk to town council and come to a conclusion on it, and that would not take very long. I don't think that would be a hindrance in the committee or the trust's ability to become a player in the market.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, does that answer your question?
It gets me further down the road, yes.
Okay.
So do we actually need to have a motion and take a vote on the creation of the work group?
We may do. I think what we need to do is make a motion to make a recommendation to the Board of Selectmen that this is the next steps in our goal, and deliver to them either for their next meeting or a subsequent meeting.
Because they would appoint the work group, is that, or just for information? I don't know if we have authority to appoint a work group.
I don't know the answer to that either.
That's something that probably Libby or Greg could answer as well. If we say, this is what we're thinking, this is what we'd like to do, and then they can say that needs to go to the select board, or you appoint, I don't know how it would work, but they could answer that, I'm sure. Can I just throw something out there, sorry, before, just kind of incorporating some of what Ken and Ann have both said, a little bit of Brian, just to make sure I'm understanding what our timeframes are. It sounds like with between just being realistic about how long it would take to actually do something, and also with Richmond coming online potentially in the next 2 months, that we're not really doing anything with this in the next 4 to 6 months. We don't need to, but we've got up to maximum 18 months before we would have to do something, because that gives us a 6-month window to then advertise and acquire properties in response to the need for safe harbor. Is that correct, Ken? I think that's what you were saying. Yeah. So I was kind of thinking about how we would address this, and thinking about that within that 18 months being our max, wanting to do it well, wanting to do it right, not really being able, to your point, Ann, I don't think we can prove this is a successful program until we've actually responded to a need to get us into safe harbor in 2 years. So I don't know that realistically funding in the next town meeting, I don't think we would be able to do that, because we wouldn't say this was a successful program yet. So I was just thinking, based on what Ken was saying, I still think it's important to look at this as 4 pieces for a work group, including that strategic implementation of this after the first 3 parts. And I think each part, to me, has four elements to it. I wrote it down, sorry. This group needs to define the step. The work group reviews, the work group provides feedback. This board incorporates the feedback, identifies if we have more questions, need more resources, and does it change anything about the number 2? I think this group should sort of lightly define all 4 first, so that we at least know what we're thinking. And then we see if we're ready to define number 2. Then we do that with each step, so we do that 4 times. So it's define, review, feedback, integrate the feedback, define, review, integrate feedback. And if we were to stick to our schedule, that would be approximately 10 months to include 2 meetings it would be 8 to 10 months, depending on how quickly we can integrate the feedback and how quickly then we can come out with kind of a final report. And so, I think there's room for movement in there, as in we can meet more. Maybe there's elements that, maybe some of the incorporating the feedback, I don't know if it's something Tucker can do to speed us along. But I think that gives us minimum 6 months, but most 10 months to get this project fleshed out in a way that is like a call and response and allows integration of feedback. And that's the kind of thing, I know it would be great to be done more quickly, but I think that this is going to take time. And I think putting pressure on this group or on the work group in a way that it's confusing will be confusing. So that's just what I've kind of been thinking about timeline.
So I'm in agreement that that's a realistic timeline. My hope is that we can come up with more deliverables between our monthly meetings. And how do we get to that place so that this board is deliberating on actual work at the time of the meetings versus trying to chunk it all out in our 2-hour window once a month. So maybe that would call for a subcommittee creation. So there's a more nimble group kind of chunking off more of the work in between to help us hit that 8-month window as a goal. Because while I do think that that is a realistic goal and I want to keep the hammer on shorter timelines, my worry is getting the work done in between and not putting the full burden on a 2-hour meeting once a month.
I think figuring out a way and a realistic timeline that allows for that, as well as the possibility that some of the feedback we may get may not need additional resources. So we may move more quickly anyways within this group. But yeah, I think again, I think there's room for moving it more quickly, but it depends on this group being able to, or a subcommittee, to be able to meet in between.
So the question, if I'm in order, how about an informal report to the select board from Rita rather than formally doing something here? And is it appropriate? Who should ask Libby or whomever about the appointment? Is that something you can raise with?
If that's fine, I can send just an email to Libby just asking, what it would take for us to form this work group. This is what we're thinking, and CC you, Tucker.
I would think it kind of adds. It adds a role for the select board for buy-in, for oversight and everything like that. It may be that the way to actually appoint would be we send them a slate of people we recommend after having reviewed applications or something like that down the road, rather than have the select board have to figure that out in isolation. But I think that way we don't formally need a motion, if that makes sense.
I think that that's a good first step. I would look for, volunteer members of a work group so we can kind of chunk off some work in between now and the next meeting, if anybody would be willing to do that from this group. Do I have any volunteers?
I'm gonna elect Charity Grace since she left.
So would it,
You know what, we can hold that till Charity Grace comes back in the room.
yeah.
Let's hold that aspect.
so
Tucker.
Rita, if it's helpful, I could put together a note for Libby.
Yeah, maybe it comes from you.
And I'll copy you
CC
on
me
it for
in,
sure. Outlining, how we're seeing it. To me, and it feels like the group, some work can happen between now and your May meeting, and that really at the May meeting, you may be in a better position to be articulating what it is you're looking for specifically from these other members, so that we want to give Libby the heads up now, but that it's really following that meeting we would then be recruiting to a specific purpose and kind of job description, if you will, and with the intent of having it assembled by June.
Yeah, and working through, and the work group, this subcommittee could work on, what's the timeline? Does it fit in 6? Does it fit in 10?
Yeah.
We can work on scheduling out the larger timeline, working backwards from an acquisition in 20 months from now. How do we infill the timing?
Yeah.
So we're satisfying that safe harbor. Okay. Great. So we would need that group to be 3 or less, so we don't have to post the meetings, correct?
We'll wait for Charity Grace.
Rena had her hand up. Were you
No,
volunteering?
I was kind of volunteering.
think
I'm
it's-
also willing
I
to be
know.
on the group,
Yes.
so.
Brooke and I were sort of like, yeah.
I'm going to say that I can't be on the work group, on that subcommittee. So.
Fair, thank you. And I would hope to encourage members of the public that aren't on the board that push us over a requirement, either Tucker, town's real estate. What's the title?
Specialized.
The town's real estate specialist input would be invaluable. Anyone else that would like to work with that subgroup?
So just to clarify, we're talking about doing a small subcommittee now to work through the process of creating the work group, defining the work group, to present to our next meeting.
To present to our next meeting, what's a real timeline that we can sit and look at
Yep.
for the whole scope and conversation? So we're not figuring it all out as we sit here in
Yep.
1 month to window.
Yeah.
So it's a report for us to review.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. So,
And can we make sure that whatever that is in the packet?
Yes.
So we have it in front of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
I would like to stress for more items
Yep.
into the packet for our next meeting. Chair Grace, we're going to look for volunteers for a subcommittee work group to deliver
Among
to
us.
this group for the next meeting, kind of some of the outlined items. So we're looking for no more than 3 members of this board of interest. Rita has stated that she's not available to be a member. So,
I'm not either.
okay. Rita, were you interested in?
Yeah, I could.
Okay, great. Brooke?
I am.
Okay. You want to flip for it? Because I am interested as well.
Okay, well, I mean, if you're interested, then
Okay,
we should do it.
great. All right, so Rima, Brooke, and I will schedule some time to get together. We'll involve Ken and Tucker. Hopefully you're available, and we can reach out to you guys. Awesome. Okay, great. So let's move on to, I guess that we're on item number 5, or should we now try to call, did we miss our window to call Laura?
We can give it a shot. I told her that we would try to call about this time.
Okay, great. So it's 91857-317-8582. Brian, thank you.
Yes.
Hello, Tucker.
Hi, Laura. This is Brian Sullivan. I'm on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund on Nantucket.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I have you with my board on speakerphone. I think Tucker may have prepared you for our call.
Yes. Yep, he did.
Excellent. Tucker, can I have you kind of chime in and recap the group on what you and Laura have discussed?
Do you want to sit up here, Tucker? I'll move down there.
Oh, that's all right. Laura, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Laura Schufeld is the assistant director of the Community Assistance Program at Mass Housing Partnership. She, just by way of background, was very helpful to the town with regard to the Six Fairgrounds process, and you all also are familiar that more recently MHB had provided some technical assistance with regard to evaluating the Nantucket Inn opportunity. So they're a tremendous resource, and I had talked with Laura about the board's desire to really advance the development of roughly half a dozen different programs as outlined in prior meetings, and just briefly, they have to do with the development of support for the creation of affordable and workforce housing by private developers on publicly owned land, either by the town or the trust. In addition, a down payment assistance program, a rental subsidy program, buy-down programs for ownership and or rental, a subsidy program for private developers on their own land, so private land, could be nonprofit or for-profit, and as well, perhaps an incentive program to entice folks who may be currently renting units seasonally to consider looking at renting them on a year-round basis and having them included on our SHI list.
Or that could even be year-round units that are renting at a affordable rate out of their own generosity, but just including them in a lottery or by putting the covenant on and qualifying.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned to the board earlier that MHP really sees what's happening around the state and beyond. So it has a really terrific perspective on what works, what doesn't work. Again, Laura is very familiar with Nantucket in particular. So we reached out to her to see, whom we may want to work with in advancing the programs that I just outlined. And sort of with that, I may turn it over to Laura or you, Brian.
Great. So Laura, we have talked about a number of these programs as a board a handful of times over the last few years. We're looking for some assistance in kind of bringing the thoughts cohesively together and some recommendations. And we're hopeful that this is something you can help us work through.
Happy to help, yeah.
Great.
So,
I guess the question would be, in working with you, what would, for us to kind of move to some results in program development, what would be the best way for us to deliver to you, an opportunity to create some recommendations for us?
well, I think looking at, the 6 things that Tucker just described, there's some, kind of pros and cons and best practices around each of them that, you probably want to investigate before you prioritize. And I think those are the kind of things that you need to do is you can't start with 6, you gotta start with 1 and build on it. You may have a couple of different ones working at the same time. But first, I think, to identify what your objective is, and then, or objectives are, because it's probably more than one objective, and then prioritize which will get to, what you're looking for, and then, which ones may not work, or may not be a priority.
So what I'm hearing is you'd look for us to deliver you 3 of these 6 programs. You could help us look at other communities that they're working on, kind of decide what opportunities are good for us, not good for us, kind of show us some past pitfalls and some past wins.
I think one of the...
I think we look at all of them.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So I think one of the things that Laura may be getting at there is, for instance, if SHI unit creation is sort of a guiding principle and objective, that the rental subsidy program is not going to help with that.
Got it. So it's outlining what...
The program won't count.
Yeah.
So it's outlining what our priorities are to then decide which of these 6 is best looked at. Okay, great.
Yeah. Hi, Laura.
And then,
Brooke Moore would like to ask a question. Go ahead.
So, it's interesting because there's a lot of talk in the community about rental subsidy. Why doesn't that? Why can't we do that? Because there's already people renting at affordable prices, or what small rental subsidy might push someone to take a unit from a seasonal to a year-round. So having an explanation as to why they don't count, so we can say we've chosen not to pursue this, is also valuable.
Yeah, rental subsidy programs don't count because the units are not restricted.
Right.
There's usually not a deed restriction on them.
Okay. But if there were,
If there's a deed restriction on it, then the unit is affordable, not the subsidies going towards to the unit, and it has to be, 15-year, at least a 15-year restriction in order for it to count.
okay. Okay, yeah, so I mean, I find when I say to people, yeah, sure, we can get your cottage qualified as a shy unit, but you have to put a deed restriction on it, that usually ends the conversation pretty fast.
And put it out to lottery.
Yeah, so,
And just, and Laura can add to this, but we were talking a little bit yesterday about, sort of different scenarios that may happen. So someone says, oh, I want to do this. I'm willing to put a restriction for 15 years on my second dwelling, with all good intent. And let's just say 5 years from now, a major life circumstance changes and they're selling the property. That restriction endures. There's no
Carries with the property.
no getting out of it.
Yeah. Okay. So, Laura, for us, what would be the next best step for this board to kind of engage with you on working with us to create some of these solutions?
Yeah, I think, probably working through what your main objectives are, that certainly will help, decide which programs are best, and then looking at who would be good peer-to-peer consultants, or not necessarily consultants, but who you can talk to who has, someone has all of these programs already up and running. Mostly, we can find folks on the Cape that have successful programs in pretty much all of these. And then, do a peer-to-peer, connect you with them so that you're not reinventing the wheel. You may, customize it for Nantucket, but there's no sense in reinventing the wheel when there's programs that are working.
Great.
So Laura, one of the programs as an example that I think has been talked about for a while here, and really in some ways it's a little different animal, but to some degree may be considered an extension in effect of the closing cost assistance program that we do have, is a down payment assistance program. You had mentioned on the phone, that there is a party or two that we may want to engage with in terms of looking at a good model of one that's working, I think, on the Cape.
Right. Our home consortium has federal money and runs a down payment and closing cost assistance program. But that's one where you need documents, you need, loan agreements and whatever for those. And, again, it's not worth reinventing the wheel with it, but it's a good program, and you may have different parameters than, because it is a federally run, or federally funded program. But the basics are what you're looking for. The person who used to be the coordinator for that for 20 years has recently retired, and he's actually doing some consulting. And if he's available, I'd suggest hiring him to help you put that program together, because I think he knows all the ins and outs and has been running the program for 15 to 20 years.
That'd be great. I'm sure Tucker will follow up with you for that contact info.
Yeah, I think Laura was going to reach out about his availability.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Who's your recommended?
She didn't. Laura, can you tell us that person's name?
Yeah, Paul Richinsky.
Paul Richinskin, and the organization. He's Ruchinskis.
Yeah. He used to be the housing specialist at the Cape Cod Commission, which at that time oversaw that program.
Great.
Yes.
Are there other questions for Laura from the board?
so there's a little bit of like the cat chasing its tail on this for me. It's almost like I don't know enough to prioritize Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the struggle I have.
Okay, well, I think that can probably, be worked out. It's kind of hard to do this over the phone.
Yeah.
But we could, I could come over and we could meet and talk about the pros and cons. I think that's gonna help you prioritize.
What-
if you-
when is our next meeting?
And pros and cons and level of funding, that you're gonna need to accomplish each of these.
May 21st.
And what it might result in unit count.
That would be incredibly helpful.
We'll be looking at our next meeting on May 21st. Are we doing second Tuesday or third
Third.
Tuesday? Third. So May 21st, if that's something you have available on your calendar. We could potentially, if you don't, we could potentially schedule a meeting outside of our regularly scheduled for this.
I could do it on
Great.
the 21st.
Excellent, we'll plan for it.
Yeah, we meet in the 10 to, starting at 10 on those third Tuesdays.
So depending on your location and ferry schedule and such.
Fortunately, she's in Barnstable.
I live on the Cape.
That works
Well,
out. Awesome.
that works out well.
So I think some of the things for us to consider as a group between now and then is, what are our priorities? Is it rental? Is it ownership? Is it using existing stock or the creation of new stock? I think those are priority questions that we can be kicking around and thinking about. So when Laura comes, we can then outline those, and then those are the kind of things that we will determine what of these programs are most appealing. I've got a hand up in the public. Ken?
Sully, is also the issue with respect to most appropriate structure? Because when I was talking to Tucker, he said that there, one of the communities set up a trust to be able to hold the title to the property, and that avoids some issues down the road. So is that something that we should be getting advice from as well?
Laura, I think that is something that we've kicked around here, as well as the land trust model that the Vineyard uses. We had a really wonderful conversation with Philippe not long ago, and the town continuing ownership of land and using lease model to. So I think that is without question a concept that we want to kind of work through and get a better understanding of.
Okay, yeah, it has its pros and cons, and maybe easier on the island, and than it was the experiment on the Cape. But it certainly works in urban areas, and with the price of land on the island, it may be useful there. But
Yeah. We often see that as our limiting opportunity is our land costs. So
yes,
how do we work around that or work with that?
right. But somebody still has to pay for the land.
Exactly.
That kind of can be what trips people up.
Right.
In a nutshell, Laura, what you said, the experiment on the Cape, what was why did that not go well?
It was, there was, both the rental part of it worked well, and it's still actually ongoing. The home ownership didn't work as well because, the homeowners were then, paying rent for the land, not a lot, but they were renting the land, and they own just their building. But it was difficult to get first-time home buyer leasehold mortgages. And it was a condominium on top of it, so it was a condominium leasehold. And, it was, even today, it's difficult to get financing for them, so the folks that bought into it in 2005 are pretty much all there because they really can't sell unless they sell to a cash buyer. And
Cash buyer wouldn't necessarily qualify. And
qualified, that's
Right,
right,
yeah.
they're qualified. So there was a couple of market units in there, and the market units still have, that you have to get a cash buyer. So the affordable folks, the folks with affordable units, are
Well, that's a
good
good one to be,
lesson.
yeah, that's a good lesson,
Not
one to
do
be
that,
aware
do
of.
not do that.
Unintended consequence.
Great, so Laura, we will look forward to a working session with you on the 21st.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much for the time for the call today and the flexibility. Sorry we
You're welcome.
missed your first window.
Yeah, sorry, I messed up my phone.
Oh, no.
Oh, well.
Well, hopefully you're squared away.
Could I just
Oh,
suggest?
wait, one more question.
I wonder if we could plan for a 3-hour meeting on that date if we're gonna do all this other work so that, Laura, I don't know what boat you prefer to take or whatever, but, or if we had to go a little bit later, like run till 1 o'clock, it just seems like this is so valuable. We don't want to get you here and then not have the chance to really fully engage the conversation. You may be interested in the rest of our conversation too, Laura, about what we're trying to do with some substantial efforts with funding we got from the election and town meeting.
Right, yeah, definitely. I mean, I just block off the whole day, so it's not, I'm available.
Great.
Just as long as you don't start too early, so.
We won't start before 10.
Probably taking Steve's shift because that's easier for me.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Bye
Thanks,
now.
Laura.
Thank you.
That was really helpful.
Yeah.
That'll be very helpful.
She's very knowledgeable, and she comes from a finance background, for a number of years before joining MHP. She's super.
Great.
So I think that, if maybe Megan, we can touch base on, well, what are the teaser questions for us to circulate around to be thinking about in preparation for that? What are our priorities as a group to be prepared to kind of talk about and talk through? We're weaning on time and we have a couple of big items still left to go. Item number 5 on the agenda list, the joint letter, the short-term rental tax proceeds. So the last few meetings, we've talked about the Airbnb tax and our intent and interest on making a request to the Board of Selectmen for some portion of those on a reoccurring basis. Tucker is in the packet?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Drafted a letter for us to review. So the concept would be that we will sign this and submit this to the Board of Selectmen at a upcoming meeting. Do you have a thought, Tucker, on how soon?
Well, this is just really following up on the board's ongoing efforts to have a reliable, ongoing funding stream. Obviously, we're in a little bit different financial position this month than we were last month. But even the 25 million, which again needs to be spent thoughtfully and efficiently and isn't going to be spent like that, it isn't going to get us all the way to where we want to be. And so this was, I think the board recognized, like, a lot of effort has gone into and continues to go into trying to advance the housing bank bill, transfer fee in support of housing, very similar structure to the land bank. And just very briefly on that, Dylan and Julian have been working quite a bit with other representatives and basically introducing a statewide version of our bill. Other communities have just been attracted to that mechanism, and so I think in the next few weeks they're planning to hold a press conference at the State House, and Ken and I and others are planning to attend. But in any event, who knows, even with more broad support, whether that will happen or not. So the short-term rental tax has happened. Currently, the select board is voted to, keep the local option at the 6%. And so this letter is basically recognizing that the original intent of that legislation was to be able to, on the local side, support both housing and clean water / infrastructure endeavors within the communities. So this is simply the board raising its hand to say, we, until there is an alternate reliable source of funding, we're requesting that the select board allocate 50% or commit to 50% of the additional revenue that this bill generates toward housing, and that the other 50% may well go toward clean water or other important issues that the town faces.
Great. Rima?
I think it's an excellent letter, and if everyone has had time to review it, I would like to make a motion that we accept the letter and have Brian sign as chair and submit it.
I'd second.
Okay, any conversation?
Discussion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Tucker.
Good
That's
job.
perfect, yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
good job.
Excellent. So we'll submit that, I'll sign it.
Immediately.
Great. All right, so that one was faster than I thought. Where did we leave off?
Yeah. I was gonna start.
So the budget sheet has been updated with the new funding that came through at town meeting. You can see that it's allocated to buckets. So as the money needs to be spent, to whom the approvals need to go to. Does anybody want to have questions?
I can just make a couple quick comments.
Great.
So, these numbers were updated based on the GL report that Megan had received on April 10th. One of the things that just frankly, we have not had time in all of the effort going into actually getting funding is to go and work with Brian's office on tighter reporting of funding. So that is sort of one of our next to-dos, is to get together with the finance office and scrub. I mean, these numbers are correct, but to maybe come up with a format that works well for the board as well as for the finance office. Right now, we're really kind of needing to pull from different report. Everything is basically put into one bucket in the finance office. And obviously, it's important to this group to be keeping track of the different sources of funding because they have different limitations.
Great.
I was just
Judith?
going to suggest that for Laura visiting us, it would be helpful for her to have you walk her through some of this, because the
Yep.
availability by bucket may affect,
Yep.
and it'd be better to do that in advance rather than have her do it on the fly so she can think about it ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tucker. This is really helpful.
I mean, it's really just a, it's based on what we had shared with the select board last fall in making our original $3 million request. And so you'll see the uses of the funds in the lower left-hand corner of the sheet are italicized. Obviously, the group has not had an opportunity to consider now the $5 million versus the original 3 requested, nor the $20 million neighborhood first. And so the 20 million really is just flowing through with no uses planned yet for fiscal 2020. And similarly, you'll see, there's sort of a net balance availability under the regular funding, Town of Nantucket Select Board, 100,000 funding. Obviously, we need to shift the sourcing and the uses to align, that we don't have a negative column, but
I think it's because there's a placeholder here for Habitat. Has it been communicated to them that there is a placeholder? And
they've actually received the 150, as has Housing Nantucket received the 225. So those funds have been paid out by the Finance Department with respect to the current fiscal year.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that they're thoughtfully thinking that we are thinking about them in upcoming fiscal year, and that their workflow is intentful on that.
So one thing I might mention, thank you for bringing that up. One thing I might mention, just knowing that they've been giving some thought to it, and maybe this would come up more formally at your next meeting, but Habitat, they're really, their biggest challenge at the moment is land. They may have an opportunity to purchase a lot to allow them to continue their production. They're going to be finished with the home here on Waite Drive very soon. And normally their model is the land is donated by the town or the trust, and they then typically it costs them around $300,000 to create the house, and they often are getting funds donated from the CPC, from this organization. Some things are donated in kind. The home buyer is given a mortgage at 0% interest for the, let's say, that full $300,000. In Habitat's helpful efforts to have their units included on the SHI list going forward, they're going to be restricted on what they can sell their homes for. And for example, their planned home, DHCD has said, doesn't matter that you've got 0% interest on your loan. This is our formula for what you can charge for the house, and it will be $206,000. So they're committed to having the unit on the SHI list. However, it means that they are going to end up short on funding this.
Right.
So I'm just mentioning that they're looking at a possibility of acquiring a lot for roughly 200 or a little less, and then constructing this home for roughly 300, so sort of a 500 venture all in. And they may well be interested in having a conversation with you all about subsidizing roughly 300 of that. So the buyer would obviously be paying back the 200, but
Who's the primary lien? The Habitat for Humanity?
Habitat holds
is
the
a-
mortgage.
Okay.
Yep.
And is that as a local entity or a
Local
larger
entity. So those monies really come back to Habitat to fund the operations of the organizations. They only have approximately 10 homes out there today, which is really the source of their operating revenue.
Yes, Ken.
So just a point of information. The funding that was approved at town meeting were two very separate buckets. The $5 million bucket was for the acquisition of land, and the $20 million bucket you've talked about separately. My question is the use of the $5 million, that is going to be the responsibility of this board. That's not within the scope of the subcommittee that you were talking about, right? Because it's a different purpose with respect to both.
That is as we see it, yes.
Okay, and the focus is still in terms of having the ability to acquire land that could then be used to create affordable housing that in fact helps us with the issues on the shy list. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. That is the intent. Circling it back to the conversation that Brian was outlining, the process on procurement is the same as he was describing for the 20 or the 5.
All right.
But as you're describing, that's how we're seeing.
Yeah. And is the thought process at this point in time, I know that you haven't had a chance to fully discuss it, but is the thought process to in fact think about having the land available to a developer type person to be able to then create housing that would be permanent housing or ownership housing, or is it the idea to try and somehow be able to retain this land yet still having it used for affordable housing?
I think, I would bring that to the entire board, but I think one of the thoughts would be, under the land trust model, how do we make it available for housing in perpetuity?
Okay. So the Sachem's Path model, does that have some level of applicability here or not?
Oh, I would say absolutely. Yeah. To RFP the project out to some type of developer to come in and absolutely. Whether it was ownership or rental, we'll have to have that discussion.
No, I was just curious because they were two separate, different buckets of funds and different purposes with respect to the reason for them.
I think the goal on the 5 million, as I personally see it and understand it, is how can we get a project of scale to get as many units on the near term, knowing the 20 million is going to be a longer, slower process.
Right. Okay.
So how do we get liftoff faster?
And I think in answer to your question about Sachem's Path, I think the conversations we've had, and my fellow board members can either concur or disagree with me, is that in the short term, because we are short on the shy list, that the rental model gives us more flexibility in terms of area median income levels of pricing and the ability for all of those units at different pricing levels to qualify for the shy list.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Rentals, I think, is our short-term goal. Once we achieve 10%, then I think we can look more at the home ownership model again, but it's not very efficient or effective because they all have to be at 80% to qualify.
Right.
So, I think that's where we've been at in terms of our prioritization for the moment, but we know we have a bigger, longer-term problem to solve on the homeownership side.
And the efficiency with respect to what qualifies relative to the properties you're buying was one of the things that drove my initial questions relative to 20 million, because in fact, the same concern is there in terms of being able to, when you have multiple levels, to have all of them qualify as opposed to just 1 or 2 units. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Ken. So are there any more comments on the budget review? Somebody want to?
Just to approve it?
Just kind of, so everybody's kind of on the same page, so we see where we're at.
I guess my question is just, so like, this will be part of the packet, like, every month going forward. Are there do you want to see it broken down in a different way? Are there things that you would like, and you don't have to answer right now, but if you have thoughts after this, just email me and, we'll try to, what I want to have is a useful dashboard to the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's helpful, and then for it to be in the packet, so it's a public document, so people can track it and see what's going on. I think that's helpful. Great, seeing no more on that, I'll close that and move to, are there any board comments? The only one that I would look for or ask or check in on is, can we, if there is an update on the data platforms project, do you guys have anything, or can we look for one to have as an agenda item for next month's meeting?
Next month.
Next month,
Great.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Can I make one comment?
Yeah, please.
I really want to express my appreciation to Tucker Holland for all the advocacy work he did in the months leading up to town meeting. I think it's there's just a lot of extra work done, and I just want to say that out loud.
Well done.
You're such a great audience.
And I guess my only comment too is just, I don't think we can say it enough, the difference a year has made. So to this board, to Tucker, to our vice chair and chair, it has been a total transformation. So I feel like we're all a little bit morose for what just happened the last month. But I don't know how to celebrate. But no, it really is massive.
300,000 in funding to 27.
Yeah.
20,
So it
$26
is
million.
It is something to celebrate in some way, shape, or form. But just thank you to everyone.
And thank you to the voters also, by the way.
yeah,
for the public to
absolutely.
hear. I think we can't thank you enough for listening to the messages that we got out there and really understanding the need and getting behind it. So.
And to Ken and CPC for what you did. That's
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
I had one update if I could. And, Tucker and I met earlier, just so you're aware, the Open Space District Working Group, is that our title?
OPZ, Open Space Zone.
Zone Working Group is going to have its first meeting on May 7th, and we'll give you an update next time, but the topics include intersection with housing issues, just so you're aware of that, including how the state safe harbor works in terms vis-a-vis open space and other things related to also hazard mitigation and conservation and everything, but part of it is housing related. We want to keep you posted on that.
Great, thank you, Judith.
Can I? Sorry, can I?
So I'll close board comments and open public comments.
Sorry. Hello. Yeah. No. Well, I just want to echo like the thanks to like this board. Like, I mean, I think it is such a incredible difference that a year makes. I think that the CPC has been amazing under Ken's leadership in really advancing the issue here. So, you know, this wouldn't have been possible without everyone making a contribution of importance. And I think maybe the moroseness is a reflection of the reality of the responsibility has now set in, which is good. So we, definitely thank the community for putting their trust in this group. So having said that, I wanted to maybe just speak very briefly about the National Planning Conference that I just attended, and I plan to write something up because there was so much good information there. Housing was the #1 issue, like across the country, and so I'll furnish a report, if you will, a written report for your next meeting, just as FYI. But one question I had was there are a number of different people I want to follow up with who I was exposed to at the conference, but among them, there is a group based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called the Lincoln Institute, which is a think tank on housing, amongst other things, but the idea of land value capture is sort of their principal mantra, and the notion behind that is that when public money is spent to create a public good, it often increases the value of private property ownership. And Judith can probably speak to this much better than I can. But in any event, one of the things that we've talked about here on the funding side of things is the idea of impact fees, which is something that Brooke and I are familiar with in Vermont. And basically, anytime you're building a home in Vermont, whether you're building 1 or you're building 10 or 100 or what have you, you're paying a fee that was determined with some nexus to cost and useful life and so forth. But, a fee that relates to or provides for, I should say, school, sewer, affordable housing, other key community components. And my understanding has been these last couple of years, or so that, you know, Massachusetts technically doesn't allow impact fees. However, having spoken with the director of the Lincoln Institute, I kind of wanted to go to the source. They're here in Massachusetts. Like, what is the deal with these? And he said, in fact, you know, maybe you have to get a little creative with what you call them, but they are effectively allowed. I am, I'm very interested to, like, either invite this fellow to come down here and speak with the group, or, you know, perhaps several of us visit him there. But if anyone else is interested, I just wanted to bring this up.
I'm very interested. That's something that I think from the start, having seen it done in other places, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I would really like to find out more.
In the sense of that interest and moving us in a direction while keeping us focused, right, and not diverging. If we were to look to bring that gentleman in early fall in hopes of bringing something to the next year's April town meeting, if we were to develop some sort of zoning opportunities that could be.
And I would suggest a joint meeting with the planning board.
Sure.
And any other town boards that this would have
Great
an
idea.
admin do it as a larger scale presentation for a larger audience.
Yeah. So
Select board would be interested too.
the general, I'm forgetting his last name, but Armando is, he's the chair of this organization, and Laura actually knows him well. And he was, I believe, the former first director as well of the Cape Cod Commission. So I think he's a wealth of knowledge.
And Megan, if you wouldn't mind grabbing the website and sending the link around to everybody. I took a look at their website. It's very interesting. They have a lot of interesting data, a la the data platform that is really, really, I mean, it's complex, but it's really interesting, so.
This is something too that I think has been, it's one thing that Matt Fee has talked about quite a bit, is whenever, whether it's a zoning change or building, how do these impact? We haven't been able to answer this. And some of the scales, I've seen it in, Burlington. It's just, here's, X percent goes to fire, X percent goes to police. And what I saw, I went to a conference 2 weeks ago, Sustainable Communities Conference in Boston, and there are some towns that have stormwater utility impact fees as well. So they calculate how much impervious surface you have on your build, and then that gets calculated and factored in. So I think there would be a lot of sort of interdepartmental interest in the conversation as well.
Great. Okay. I'll reach out.
I know that I personally have a hard stop coming, and there's one more really important item to get through.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
So, Megan, I'm going to look to you to help me lead through this next part. So,
Someone needs to make a motion to adjourn the open session, to enter executive session, not to re-enter open session. Needs to be seconded, and then everyone needs to vote by
roll call. Great.
And then after that's done, I will let me shoot Lisa a text right now.
Great.
Or she'll-
I'll recognize Judith for a motion.
I move that we go into executive session pursuant to Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, not to return to open session for the purpose of considering the purchase, exchange, lease, or value of real property where an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the public body.
Second.